Welcome to the Midnight Storytellers Legacy Project. I'm Chloe, and if you make yourselves comfortable, I have a story for you. Long ago, and far away across the cold North Sea, there was once a king. He'd conquered the lands around his own. He'd taken all the treasure and enslaved all the people, and still it wasn't enough. And then somebody told him about England, about the fine farmlands, about the winters that did not last 6 months, about the springs and the autumns and the gentle countryside, and the cowardly people who would never be able to withstand an invasion by that king's army. The king was no fool. He summoned his wise advisors, and he commanded them to cast their auguries and work their magic and tell him how to be sure and certain to conquer England and make it his own. So off they went, and they lit fires and looked into the flames and the rising sparks. They looked into the swirls of smoke. They went down to the river, and they looked at the curls of the current and the patterns in the sand. They came back to the king, and they said, "You must make your way with your army to the heart and centre of England. And when Long Compton you shall see, King of England you shall be." So the king summoned his army and his navy, and they sailed across the cold North Sea and landed on the east coast and began burning and battling and plundering their way inland. And it was just as predicted. No one and nothing could stand against them. Rumour ran ahead of the army a long way. It wasn't long before the people of Long Compton heard that this king and the invading army were heading straight for them. They were terrified. They held a meeting on the village green. All of them standing there together, the old people and the young people, the families, the children, everyone talking. And some of you have been to meetings like this. They talked, and the people who actually had good ideas were talked over by the people who thought they had good ideas and considered themselves to be important. And nothing got decided until a young farmer from the village spoke up. He said, You're being ridiculous. We cannot take on an army all by ourselves. They are professional killers. We try and stand against them, they'll cut us to pieces. No, we need different help. We need magical help. We got to ask help from the witch. And that's when everyone started shuffling and muttering, very uncomfortable. They knew who he meant. Oh yes, there was a woman who lived by herself in a strange little black and white cottage at the end of the village. All the other places were Cotswold stone. Her place, black and white. And she had cures and medicines and a herb garden. And if rabbits and pigeons went into her herb garden, they either came out wobbling or sometimes they never came out at all. And when you walked past the witch's cottage, when the windows were open, sometimes snatches of song would drift out. The kind of song that would wrap itself around you and hold you in place and stand you there, lost in dreaming. People went to her for their cures, but they were nervous about her. So the villagers turned to the young farmer and said, "Well, it's your idea. You go and talk to her." Off he went. Up to the cottage, up the little garden path, knocked on the door, and he was nervous. It was a long time since he'd seen her. He was expecting some old crone. When the door swung open, out of the gloom of the hallway stepped a surprisingly young woman in a gown of green and white, with long dark hair and a calm face and eyes as deep green and still as pools of water in the forest. The farmer said, if you please, wise lady, the villagers of Long Compton need your help. There's a king, and there's an army, and they're coming to kill us. She said, I know. Well, we don't know what to do. Please, please, wise lady, can you help us? She said, I will help you if you will help me. Well, I don't know any magic. I need you to go back to the villagers and ask them to bring out from their stores the best that they've put away of food and drink. And you, young man, you will put all of that on a cart and you will take it to where the enemy is encamped, and you will offer them that food and drink as a feast of welcome, because that will keep them there while I prepare what I must do. I can't go near them. They'll kill me soon as look at me. No, they won't. Go to them and smile as you offer them the feast. Go to them and smile and think of your family. Think of your farm and the animals in your fields and your crops and your friends. Think of everyone and everything that you love and want to protect. Hold them in your head and your heart, and no one will harm you. Oh, all right. I'll do it. Good. And there's one more thing. Oh, there's always one more thing. What is it? I need you to bring me a bucket of milk that you've milked yourself from your best cow. Take it with you on the cart. Can you remember that? Yep, milk. I can do. So off he went back to the village, and you can imagine the villagers of Long Compton were so relieved to have nothing more difficult or dangerous to do than give up some winter stores. And they loaded up that cart and they patted the young man on the back, very pleased that it was him and not them going anywhere near the enemy. And they watched him shake the reins and click to the horse. And the two of them drove off together up that long, slow hill out of Long Compton towards the sunset. It wasn't difficult to find the enemy camp. You just had to follow the trail of dead creatures along the roadside. And then he came around the corner and there were two sentries with spears pointed straight at his throat. The farmer reined in the horse and put a smile on his face, and he said, "Good evening, lads. I brought a feast of welcome from the villagers of Long Compton. Can I take it on into the camp?" And the sentries looked at each other. This was the first person they'd met in England who hadn't run away from them. They let him through. The farmer drove the horse and cart into the enemy camp, and there were pavilions and there were tents and there were campfires as far as the eye could see. There were the sounds of armor being mended and swords being sharpened. In the middle of it all, an open space and the king's pavilion with banners fluttering. And the king himself in his bright armor striding out. The farmer bowed to him from the cart seat. "Your Majesty, I bring to you an offering from the villagers of Long Compton. There's a good lot of drink on here and some very good food. We'd like you to stop and refresh yourselves before you go any further." And the king smiled, a slow, cruel smile. They were giving up. This place, these people, so vital to his plans for conquering England, they were not resisting at all. So he graciously accepted the feast and called his soldiers to unload it from the cart. And when they'd done it, the drink was flowing already, the quarrels were starting, and very, Quietly, without anybody noticing, the farmer turned the empty cart around and shook the horse's reins, and he drove out and away. By now it was full night. The Cotswold sky near to bursting with stars, owls hooting across the valley, and the track glimmering chalky white in front of him. And he was just starting to breathe freely again as he drove the horse along. And suddenly something moved at the side of the road. He thought it was a tree. What was it? It was the wise woman. She had been standing there wrapped in her cloak, looking like a dead tree. But then she moved, and her face was pale in the starlight. She smiled at him. "You've done well. You've been very brave. Now, there was one other thing I asked you to do. I wonder if you remembered. There was yeah, I know, the bucket of milk. I got it here under the seat." And he reached under the seat and he handed over the bucket of milk. "Thank you," she said. "You have done well. Now, you've played your part. Get back to the village and tell all of them to stop indoors until I've done what I must do here. Go on, get along with you." So he clicked to the horse and set off again. But as he went a little further along the road, his curiosity was itching at him, and he couldn't resist. He turned the horse and cart aside, parked it in a field, left them there, and crept back behind the hedge. He went back to the place where he'd left the wise woman, and he peered through the leaves of that hedge to see what she was doing. And what she was doing was exceeding strange. She had that bucket of milk, and she was walking in a circle, and she was pouring that bucket of milk on the ground in a circle. And as she walked and poured, she sang. She sang one of those songs that twisted and curled and wrapped itself around you and held you in place, dreaming. And as she sang and walked and poured the milk, there were glints of gold and silver, sparkles of emerald in the air. And those sparkles swirled and coalesced and became the shapes of very small people. Those people wore crowns and gowns and long flowing cloaks, and there was a suggestion, a shimmer of wings at their backs. The wise woman curtsied to them and began to speak with them. The farmer realized he was looking at the little people. And in those old times, everyone knew the fair folk, the little people, the lords and ladies, the fairies. They weren't safe. They weren't nice. They weren't sweet. They weren't helpful. You had to be very, very careful dealing with the fair folk. Only someone like the wise woman knew enough to summon them and speak with them and come out alive. The farmer knew it wasn't even safe to look at the little people, so he turned away, he covered his eyes, and as he did so, a magical sleep overwhelmed him and dropped him fast asleep on the ground. And he didn't wake up until the next morning. He woke up damp and shivering, and there was a skylark high overhead, and there was something oozy, and there was a slug in his ear, and he picked himself up and he dusted himself down. And then from down the track there came a sound that nearly stopped his heart. There were boots marching, there were horses neighing, harness jangling, swords beating on shields. The army was on the march. The army was advancing towards Long Compton. The witch had done nothing to stop them, he thought. He took his own tiny knife out of his belt and he was going to push through the hedge and try to stop that army all by himself when there was a swirl of dust and leaves in the road, and suddenly the wise woman was standing there. The front ranks of the army came around the corner and stopped in confusion when they saw her, and the rest of the army crunched to a halt behind them. The king came striding through, elbowing his own men out of the way. He walked right up in front of the woman and he said, "Get out of our way. We are here to conquer England and make it our own." You know, the woman didn't even blink. She looked the king straight in the eye. She said, "Your Majesty, you've come a long way to meet your destiny. There is something you need to hear. If this land your own you would make, 7 long strides you must take, and if Long Compton you can see, then King of England you shall be." And the king from the northern land looked past the wise woman and saw that 7 of his long strides would indeed bring him to the brow of the hill, and from there he could look down into the valley to the village of Long Compton. So he took the first 3 strides and a couple more, but as he lifted his boot for the final stride, the ground shook and he stumbled, and right across the path in front of him heaved up a huge mound of earth, blocking his way and blocking his view. He couldn't see over the top. He couldn't see the village. This was the magic worked by the fairy folk. This is what the little people, the lords and ladies, did in return for the wise woman's gifts of song and milk. As the mound settled, the king realized he'd been tricked, he'd been stopped, and he seized his dagger and he lunged for the wise woman with a roar of rage. But she laughed and she danced away from him up on top of the mound, chanting down at him, chanting magic down at him, while the king's bodyguard formed a circle and hurried forward to protect their king. And the wise woman looked across all of them. "As Long Compton you cannot see, King of England you shall not be. Rise up, stick, and rise up, stone. King of England you shall be none." And at those words, the king suddenly found himself rooted to the spot. His feet couldn't move, his legs couldn't move, and 3 heartbeats later, the whole of him had turned to cold, hard stone. The bodyguards were screaming and rushing forward, but again the wise woman hurled more words, more magic at them, and it rolled over them and rooted them to the spot, and they too were turned to stone, some of them clinging to each other, some of them trying to run, some of them had flung themselves flat on the ground, and there they are to this very day, the stone circle, the Rollright Stones, and none of them will ever move again. And when silence had come back, the witch sighed and turned and looked straight at where the young farmer was hiding behind the hedge. "You can come out now. I'm glad you have seen this. You can go back to the village and tell everyone what has happened. but you must leave me here. I must stay to guard all of these and make sure they do no more harm. And one last time she smiled at the young farmer with her pale, calm face and her eyes as deep green and still as pools of water in the forest. She turned and walked along the hilltop a little way. It seemed to the farmer that she particularly chose a place to stand. And then she reached out and she stretched up. And as she did so, all the green and white of her gown and the brown of her cloak and the dark of her hair lifted and swirled and changed into tree bark and branches and twigs and green leaves and thousand upon thousand of tiny white flowers. In front of his eyes she transformed into an elder tree in full blossom. And all the stones are there. You can visit them. There is the King's Stone on one side of the road, leaning, reaching hopelessly for what he will never have. And yes, the bodyguard, the circle of the Rollright Stones on the other side of the road, they're all there. But the elder tree is much harder to find. If ever you do, you might want to greet her and give her your thanks, for she will be there to the end of time, guarding the heart of England.